Yeah.
Our final week 5 thoughts, looking ahead to the rest of the season and maybe even talking through some of the major changes for the New York Jets. That is what we're doing today on RotoViz Overtime as we move on, Shawn, towards week 6. I have looked at some rosters, as I mentioned last week. You go in, you look to see what players are maybe missing bye-wise, and this week, obviously significant with some of the Monday Night Football parts, the likes of the Kansas City Chiefs not available, but getting back some of the Lions. I'm sure a lot of people out there are enjoying adding Lions and Eagles back into those starting lineups ahead of week 6. But we're going to look at some of the final stages of NFL week 5. Shawn, I think we'll kick it off with a quick summary maybe of the New York Jets situation, which I find a kind of bizarre from my perspective in terms of Robert Saleh being dismissed as the head coach after their loss in London. It has historically turned out to be really bad for the losing team coming back from those international games in the UK in terms of coaches being dismissed after it. So Saleh falls to that again, but they obviously have a tough loss versus the Vikings. The Vikings now 5-0. We talked briefly about it on the Monday episode, but losing to the Vikings is going to happen to a lot of teams this season. They have one of the best defenses in the NFL, it looks currently. The Jets are also one of the best defenses, and to fire a defensive head coach, then put his defensive coordinator as the interim head coach moving forward. It feels like a little bit of maybe a jump to a conclusion here. Offense has been the issue in this, and this past week in London, they really struggled in terms of Aaron Rodgers' overall performance, and I don't think that can necessarily be put entirely on the head coach, but we do get a change, defensive coordinator coming in to overtake it. I don't think we're probably going to see that much change on offense unless we get better quarterback play from, admittedly, one of my favorite players of all time, Aaron Rodgers. But, we get a lot of targets this week to Garrett Wilson, which was positive to see. But in terms of the overall production of the vast amount of targets, the miscommunications, whether that's on him or Rodgers, I feel like at this point it may be on the quarterback side of the error scenarios there. Do we expect anything to change in New York unless we see better quarterback play here?
No, I wouldn't think so. This is a move to pander to Aaron Rodgers, right? And to cover up for the fact that they hired an offensive coordinator who can't get the job done. Sometimes, even if you are not the problem, if you lose that power struggle within the building, then you're going to be out and waiting on that new opportunity. I'm sure he will land on his feet. It's frustrating to go from a head coach to then next year you're looking at probably being a coordinator. You work back through, you work your way up. I would think that he has a good argument that he is not the problem here. Sometimes it's just not a good fit, right? One of the things that we are witnessing right now is that Brian Flores appears to be doing a fantastic job there in Minnesota. He was obviously not the solution for the Miami Dolphins. The defensive mindset, the defensive approach, the lack of faith in Tua, not only did it not work, but it created problems, for the Dolphins as they're trying to build an organization. Maybe there's some issue along those lines here. As you were talking, the thing that kind of popped into my head was that Saleh has been critical at times of Breece Hall for not being basically even better, for not being somebody that he's not, which, Breece Hall is a bigger back, but in many ways, he's a supercharged version of Saquon Barkley, right? Where you're not looking for Barkley to go break a lot of tackles. That's not what he does well. Both of these backs, and certainly the skill that Breece Hall has, is this combination of the patience of, say, a Le'Veon Bell, and then once you get to the second level, you have speed that Bell did not have, right? And so you can be Le'Veon Bell plus, and almost every team out there would be over the moon to have that type of player, whereas the Jets have kind of focused on, well, when he's contacted at the line of scrimmage, sometimes he goes down too easily. Let's draft a bunch of additional running backs. If he has a couple of bad plays, let's put them in. And if they look good, let's make this a committee. we don't know who that's on, right? It doesn't necessarily seem like Aaron Rodgers has supported Breece Hall. It doesn't seem like Nathaniel Hackett has figured out ways to get him involved. One of the things that I talked about both on Stealing Bananas and then in my write-up was that this is a situation coming in where the Vikings blitz a lot and they stuff the run. So it's not a great situation at all for the running backs who did nothing. But if you're going to respond to that by essentially giving up and just using your running backs as extra blockers, I mean, if you're going to motion into formations where the defense knows that guy is just picking up a blitzer, why not play with extra offensive linemen? Now, it would be infuriating from a fantasy perspective, watching all of these plays where your guys aren't even on the field. But, I mean, they frankly weren't on the field in the way that they were deployed against the Vikings. They're being used as offensive linemen. That's not the way to use Breece Hall. And if you're a Braylon Allen fan, which we are, he's on the Dynasty team that we just drafted. We're excited about him. I mean, one of these two guys needs to score a lot, or it needs to be a big pie and they can score a lot together. You can't afford to have a lot of games like this where you're trying to go through people like Alan Lazard, Tyler Conklin. I'd like to think that maybe the coaching change fixes a little bit of that. Maybe Saleh was a little bit of the problem there. But mostly this is just Aaron Rodgers is playing really poorly. Nathaniel Hackett is using an archaic offensive scheme. They won the power struggle. They got rid of the head coach whose side of the ball looks really good. We'll see what happens now.
Yeah, we'll see as well if they can get a bit of motion into that offense. That might be something that would be beneficial to them moving forward. But yeah, we'll see what happens. But I thought that was surprising. You mentioned he'll land on his feet. Shawn, I'm kind of hoping that he might even land his way down to Green Bay. He was the best man at Matt LaFleur's wedding, so I would imagine that they're pretty close. Maybe we'll see them pair up. Would be pretty nice, but we'll see as the season moves ahead. But moving into Monday Night Football, a little bit more of a defensive struggle than maybe we were hoping in terms of fantasy fireworks. The Kansas City Chiefs win 26-13 in this one. Shawn, the Chiefs have now won 11 straight games without scoring more than 27 points, which is now an NFL record. They almost did it this week. They were at 26, but we've talked a little bit recently about Patrick Mahomes, the fantasy scoring, not really, hitting the levels that he would have earlier in his career. He has 331 yards in this, no touchdowns, one interception. Kareem Hunt has 27 carries for 101 yards and a touchdown. Patrick Mahomes has 6 carries for 22. And then Carson Steele, Shawn, again, has a fumble in this one. He's fumbling at a pretty historic rate at this particular point. He has 5 carries for 12 yards. Really isn't getting a lot done here for the offense. Worthy has 1 carry for 3 yards for that rushing touchdown. I guess when we're looking at it, we know that Rashid Rice is out. What is the future of this Chiefs offense now as we step forward with, we look at a situation here where JuJu Smith-Schuster looked a bit like Kareem Hunt. They both look better than we probably had anticipated, but he has 8 targets, 7 receptions, 130. One of those being a 50-yard reception where he just was on track for the majority of those 50 yards. Kelce, though, maybe is back into that tight end conversation of 10 targets, 9 receptions, 70 yards. I think that he's going to see that continued usage throughout the season. But Worthy, Shawn, just the 6 targets, 3 receptions, 25 yards going his way. The rest of the targets and the receiving spread around the rest of the roster. Before we get to the Saints side of things, the Chiefs looks like it's going to be leaning obviously on Kareem Hunt, 27 carries, 39 total carries for the team in the rushing game. And then it feels like here that JuJu Smith-Schuster is in that Rashid Rice role and leading the way versus looking more towards Worthy in this particular contest, at least.
Yeah, it depends on if you're watching this game as a Chiefs fan, as a fantasy analyst, as someone who maybe added JuJu and played him in desperation. There were a lot of things going on in this game that were interesting. The number one thing I think is just this game, I think, very firmly demonstrated that the Chiefs are a full tier, if not like a couple of tiers above any other team in the NFL, because the New Orleans Saints are probably pretty good, right? They probably have a solid to slightly above average offense with Clint Kubiak doing a nice job, with Alvin Kamara looking revitalized. I mean, he got completely wiped out of this game, but even in that environment had a really nice change of direction run early, where one of the best, like 7-yard runs that you're ever going to see. They have Rashid Shaheed emerging as a secondary threat. They've been able to get those tight ends involved to score some one-off touchdowns. And then their defense is good. Maybe not elite, but good. And I mean, this game could have very easily been, 45-6. So on the one hand, the Chiefs do need to start putting teams away and to stop making some of these sort of ridiculous mistakes. The goal line interception, which threatened to really turn this game, was a ball where you'd like to see a little better accuracy from the supposed greatest quarterback of all time on that pass. And then even with it being inaccurate, I mean, JuJu has to catch it, not bat it for an interception. So we continue to see those types of mistakes. We blamed a lot of them on Kadarius Toney. He obviously was the culprit in a lot of those situations, but other guys are failing to make those plays. At the same time, you got the impression that Andy Reid meant business in this game, where he was tired of his offense getting stopped. I do wonder how much of a just complete collapse now we're going to be looking at from the Saints, because at some point you're wondering, like, what is this team taking away? Now, in the end, Kareem Hunt averages less than 4 yards per carry. That's a little bit surprising to me, although when you're going to run a lot into situations where the other team knows you're going to run, maybe you get that. You run 27 times, unless you have an explosive play, your yards per carry average isn't going to be great. I think if you're a skeptic, you point to the fact that he carried 27 times and an 8-yard gain was his long run. If you're an enthusiast, you look at this and say, the offense looks much better with him than it looked with Isaiah Pacheco. And the rest of these guys are complete non-starters in terms of being out there on the field at all. The offense also looks better than it looked under, any of the time periods with Clyde Edwards-Helaire. So, I mean, I'm hoping that he's able to overcome the mental health problems and that he does get out there and he gives them a little bit of a compliment. But it would be shocking at this point if this is not Kareem Hunt's team, and he looks like he's going to be a big-time fantasy asset for everybody who has him, right? It's a reminder, and I wrote about this in the Zero RB Universe last week, that the running back quality, which you can judge through a lot of things, one of which is just if you can earn volume, but then on that volume, what are your peripherals like? That's going to be broadly indicative of what we can expect in the future. And if players are performing poorly, it is a very bad sign, and you have a lot of collapse risk. You also have risk even for players who are good, like a Breece Hall and a Travis Etienne. It does sound like Etienne's lack of involvement is related to health. And yet, if your coaches have been putting out these kind of weird notes about you for years where they want you to be different. And we've got a couple of situations here with Breece Hall and Travis Etienne where these guys have the most explosive backs in the NFL, and they're constantly like, yeah, but what if you were also a big back who ran like David Montgomery? It's like, well, if you wanted that, you should have just signed that guy in free agency, right? You could have picked Zach Moss off the street and gotten what little you get out of that, as opposed to, say, having a Chase Brown. But within that, there's a lot of room for running backs to perform differently year to year and for them to perform differently in different contexts. It seems to me, in terms of the analysis and the rhetoric around running backs, is that at a certain point for certain players, we've collapsed the way that we're thinking about range of outcomes down to this guy's completely washed, he can't play. And that's not the right way to think about it. So you have some guys like a Kareem Hunt who can be very useful here. And again, I mean, this is a situation where I would argue that even with terrible peripherals last season, due to the trajectories of both players, we have plenty of reason to believe that Kareem Hunt's still a lot better than, say, Ezekiel Elliott, for example. So I think that that's going to work. I don't know. Colm, I found this game pretty disheartening. We got 18 targets for JuJu and Travis Kelce, only the 6 for Worthy. I think that there's still plenty of room for excitement. I mean, he's going to have a fine season. Anytime that you are getting manufactured like goal line carries, then you can score fantasy points. Anytime that you have all of those air yards, one of which drew a DPI, and so the reality value of that. And then a second one was a very obvious one that should have been called. Although on that play, the ball actually goes through his hands. Like, keep paying attention and catch the ball, right? A catch is better than drawing pass interference. Maybe not in reality, but it goes on your stats. It makes people excited. Catch the ball, right? You can't rely on the officials. They don't always call it. It was like deep in garbage time and didn't matter at all. But any New Orleans Saints fans can be like, that one wasn't nearly as bad as late in the game where the Chiefs defender goes through the back, like tackles the guy, pushes him down, knocks the ball away. And the officials are just like, we're going to let that go. So you're going to have plenty of plays that aren't called, right? There's room for enthusiasm, but 7 for 130 for JuJu Smith-Schuster. And I would say on that one, JuJu Smith-Schuster is below the level of a player who should be in an NFL game. For the Saints to give up 7 catches, 130 yards, and often have no one around him, it's kind of one of these things where simultaneously you're thinking only JuJu Smith-Schuster will be out on the field and have the defense pretend that he doesn't exist. At the same time, if your defense can't stop JuJu, then again, I do worry about absolute collapse right now for this Saints team, especially with Derek Carr a little banged up.
The JuJu, if you're looking at it again for the positive negative, the one target that wasn't completed was a goal line target that then turned into an interception. So he could have had 8 for 135 and a touchdown, which obviously would have been an even bigger day. But the one thing I thought on that 50-yard run, Shawn, after the catch was, if that was Rashid Rice, that would have been a touchdown. Like, there was nobody, like there was no Saints defender able to catch.
Well, I mean, they had 3 guys back there.
I still
it wouldn't necessarily been a touchdown, but he would have closed the gap between himself and where the defenders were in about 1/4 of the time.
Yeah. So the part with the Worthy thing is the box score shows the 3 receptions for 25 yards, the 2 deep targets, one for the PI, one that could have been PI. Both of those, changed the outlook dramatically. Then he is getting those, carries, as you mentioned. He has, 4 touchdowns through 5 games of his NFL career. There's a lot of positives there, but we would like to see that volume in terms of the targets increase. Well, in general, with the rookie, this is a pretty positive start, but just not on the level of what we're seeing from the likes of Brian Thomas or Neighbors, for example. But I think it still has a lot of positive signs as we move forward here.
It's going to be good, and not having Rice does free him up to the draw targets. He's probably going to draw a lot of air yards. He's going to have some of these spike week games. There's a path here to pretty exciting volume. And that may be the case coming out of the bye. I certainly have seen people cover this in a pretty enthusiastic way. But man, I mean, this game was sitting there as a chance to really help fantasy managers before you then have to, wait through the bye. Folks who watch this game, which is probably everyone, already are aware of this, but he did have a play where he comes wide open and wouldn't have been in a contested catch situation on a vertical target, which he was on the 3 bombs. And that one probably goes for a long score if Mahomes sees it correctly. He also has one where it's more of those just filler types of targets that you need to get to the kind of overall line that you want, where he comes across the field. There's a little bit of a pick play. The whole play is set up for him. He gets moved off of his line a little bit in the way that all of the kind of road furniture happened there in the middle of the field. And because of getting distracted by that, then he turns back around and is surprised when the ball is on him on a play that's obviously what was going to happen. Like, how are you distracted by this stuff over here? Turn around and catch the ball. So again, I love him. I think he's going to be awesome. It was such a cool moment when he gives the football to his mom. It just would have been nice to have a 25-point game here, which was sitting on the table in this one.
Yeah, and the other thing is, we look back to last year with Rashid Rice, they did start to implement him a lot more in the offense post their bye week. He also did have, I mentioned the Carson Steele fumble, he did have the recovery on that one. But let's jump over to the Saints. You mentioned Derek Carr being a little banged up. He is scheduled to have an MRI today on an oblique injury. He had 18 of 28, 165 yards, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. Jake Haener came in to finish the game out. The big problem here, Shawn, you mentioned the Chiefs and what level that defense is at. I think what they are is they're very consistent and they're complementary to the different parts of the defense. Like the players all are obviously working very well together and particularly limiting explosive plays. Now, they do give up a 43-yard touchdown to Rashid Shaheed in this one. He has 4 receptions for 86 yards and a touchdown on 9 targets. But outside of that, the longest play they gave up was Alvin Kamara's reception for 14 yards. The running game, 9 yards was the longest play they give up there. And you know, they've really limited this offense to any big plays, which meant obviously you're having to struggle to work the ball down the field and then not make any mistakes from your own side. So the takeaway here for me is more in the receiving game. We've seen Shaheed become more and more involved. We've seen him have a lot of success on those deep plays. Gets one here, gets in the end zone. 9 targets, as I mentioned, going his way. 8 targets to Kamara. We get 5 to Juwan Johnson. Shawn, Chris Olave, 2 for 10 with 4 targets. What are we thinking here as we move forward with the kind of ranking of the offensive wide receivers here with Shaheed and Olave?
We have enough background on this that you have to keep Olave ahead, but he's been certainly one of the biggest disappointments. And with the lack of other like down-to-down weapons, defenses are able to scheme him away. And I mean, you think about this particular game where the Chiefs are just so good at everything. You mentioned the consistency, but they can stop the run almost entirely and at the same time wipe out the opponent's best receiver. You know, being focused on the offense, it was frustrating a few years ago when they use one of those picks that they got from the Tyreek Hill trade to move up and take Trent McDuffie. But he is now, you know, one of, if not, I mean, certainly in the conversation as the best defensive back in the NFL. And they're just wiping the top opponent option completely out of the game. So if you can't pass to your star and you can't run the ball, then teams just don't have anything they can do against this Kansas City Chiefs defense. You don't have Ladarius Sneed. That does open it up a little bit for the number 2 guy to occasionally, you know, make a nice play like Shaheed did. Their ability to connect on deep passes has been pretty crazy. One of the big strengths of Derek Carr is throwing that deep ball. And so if you lose him, you're going to, I think, really collapse. The frustrating part probably for a lot of Saints fans is that I believe it's the play immediately before the 4th and 8 throw where he goes out of the game then. I mean, obviously they're coming off the field regardless, but that appeared to be the play that he was injured. He had kind of made the claim, if I was reading this correctly, that it was the previous play where he was hurt. That was one where you have Shaheed down the sideline, potentially open, and he underthrows it pretty dramatically and had fallen away from that throw, even though the pressure was sort of behind and to the side, not in his face. And, you know, that's one where you got to step up and you've got to get your body into it and get the ball down the field. It's weird in part because that connection has been so strong and it's a strength of Carr. It's also weird in that if his technique, or just maybe the technique was a result of having somehow injured himself earlier in that play. But that was a weird sequence and kind of an unfortunate way and from a lot of perspectives to end the game. But Colm, this was just so completely one-sided. 26-13 doesn't do it justice at all. The Chiefs had 80 plays to 51 for the Saints. They averaged 1.5 yards per play more. Obviously, that gives you a massive gulf in the total yards. The Chiefs had more than double. But you think about how these possessions work and what it means for the Saints when you get those 3 and outs because of this Chiefs defense. They throw the pick on the first drive, and then you have a 10-play touchdown drive for the Chiefs. You do get your one decent stop, but then a 10-play drive, a 15-play drive, a 9-play drive. Those are all scores. You come back out of the half and a 10-play drive with a missed field goal, a 9-play drive that ends with that interception at the goal line, which actually had the greatest run back maybe in NFL history. You love it when a defensive player who maybe doesn't have the body type that you're thinking about for a run back catches the ball and is like everyone else in the defensive community. When you get a turnover, you don't celebrate. You don't run side to side and look for people to toss the ball to.
Don't
take the ball and you don't take a knee. You run as fast as you can downhill toward the goal that scores for you. One of the coolest things I've seen in a long time. But then a 5-play touchdown drive, 11-play field goal drive. It's not just that the Chiefs are scoring or missing field goals or committing turnovers at the goal line on every drive. It's that the entire oxygen is being sucked out of these games. And while I think it's a risk for the Chiefs because, again, the Saints actually were back in the game after that goal line interception, it's also something where this strategy that teams are taking where they're letting the Chiefs run, they're not creating a lot of pressure on Patrick Mahomes. You're forcing these long drives, and you're thinking if we can just limit the number of possessions, we get lucky because you get a Carson Steele fumble, you get one of these weird Patrick Mahomes interceptions that are leaking into the games now, and it's close, and you have a shot. But at the same time, when your defense has to play the entire game, you don't get the chances to do the things you want to do on your own offensive side. Once the game's already happened and you know the outcome, it's easy to say, oh, well, we should have done things differently, when to an extent, a lot of the teams are actually having it work in their favor. But there is this downside to being so conservative against the Chiefs that you keep the games close. It's also just kind of non-competitive, which I think that's been something that even as the overall product for NFL has been bad, and even as defenses have been successful, there is, I think, a risk of being passive enough on defense that you lose what makes elite football teams great, which is this sense of dominating, this sense of, you hear all the time about establishing the run and we're going to be more physical than their team and we're going to do all these macho things. And I think as a fantasy analyst or a reality analyst, you can laugh at those things and say, look, I mean, football, like anything else, is going to come down to tactics, and you need to execute your overall strategy. And then within the game, you need to understand the game management and the specific drive tactics, those types of things. All of that is true, but it can be simultaneously true that the teams that win at the highest level really are imposing their will. And the passiveness of so many of these defenses, I think, is taking that away from units. And you can see on a team with the Vikings where maybe you're courting some risk with the way that Brian Flores is coordinating the defense and calling these defensive plays. And at the same time, you have given your team back this permission to be physical, to be fast, to be dynamic, to make plays. All of those things, I think, are fun for fans because it's more what they think of as football. And when you execute it and when you do it well, it can still be much more valuable than what we're so often getting from teams where their main goal, you have that Arthur Smith approach. You have arguably, what you're getting from an offensive perspective with the Steelers, which is just, let's stick in it. Maybe the opponent will make the mistakes, as opposed to going out there and dominating.
Speaking, Shawn, of aggressiveness, and kind of trying to push the pedal to the metal, in Sunday Night Football, the Steelers lost 20-17 towards the very end to the Dallas Cowboys. The comment I made there about, effort and things like that relates around George Pickens, who at points of this game looked like he had absolutely no interest in being out there on the football field. He has 7 targets, 3 receptions, 26 yards. He also, as the game expires, catches the Dallas player by the face mask, which, I'd be surprised if it doesn't get him into, a fine situation. I wouldn't expect a suspension, but there's a lot of
questionable things around Pickens at different points in terms of his effort levels. This game had some that I'd be very concerned about. It felt like the Steelers were going pretty well in this one, but it led to a situation where they don't get the ball in the end zone. They don't continue to push it. One of the things that I've talked about in some of the Steelers games, Shawn, is Justin Fields and looking to get more designed runs. He does have 6 rushes in this. It's looked like it was going to start off that maybe they were designing some stuff for him, but he only has 27 rush yards on that. Najee Harris goes 14 for 42. This was a game, obviously, where Jalen Warren was out. Fields does have 2 passing touchdowns, just 131 yards. And when you look at the box score around the Pittsburgh receivers, you can see why the passing game is also struggling. I think Fields has looked better as a quarterback over the last couple of weeks, and they continue to be competitive in games, but I think there's a lot being left on the field in terms of the receiving core and what they have around him in this situation. You get those 7 targets to George Pickens, you get 5 to Van Jefferson, and then 2 to Najee Harris, 2 to Connor Hayward, who does get in for a touchdown. Pat Firemouth has 3 targets he gets in for a touchdown. But overall, the offense, there's not a lot. You sometimes make the comment about NFL players. There's a lot of players on this, receiving core that are very, very questionable in terms of the talent. And there's obviously some trade talks around different players around the league. I think any of those ending up in Pittsburgh, obviously the offseason conversation for a long time was around the likes of a Brandon Ayuk. This team really needs help in that receiving room that would, elevate this offense, I think, quite considerably. On the other side, Dak Prescott, 352 yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. CeeDee Lamb showing potentially some frustration throughout the game here. He has 9 targets, 5 receptions for 62. Which on the big takeaway here, the player that we've kind of talked about a little bit throughout the offseason, I probably wanted to draft him a little bit too much. But over the last couple of weeks, we've seen him show flashes. And in this game, he became the prime option for the Dallas offense. Now, part of that might be down to the game plan of the Steelers and who they can cover, mainly being CeeDee Lamb. But he has 10 targets in this, leading the team, 7 receptions, 87 yards, and a touchdown, including the touchdown to win the game when he was a little bit banged up towards the end of it. Any takeaways that you want to highlight from this?
They did completely and totally dominate this game. It was exciting to see Jalen Tolbert play so well. Kind of have been yo-yoing him back and forth on the redraft rosters. Certainly didn't have him on most of those this week, which is disappointing because, now if you want to put him back on there, it's going to cost quite a bit. He is one of the people that we focused most heavily on in the last month of drafting, have a great best ball share there. And so it's fun to see that score at those prices. You think about what the Cowboys have done recently, and they've been so weirdly one-dimensional. But at the same time, unlike so many teams, they appear to understand kind of where their bread is buttered, right? And you have CeeDee Lamb. You don't have a lot of talent at the running back position. And even if you end up in a game here where you throw 42 times and only get the 9 targets to CeeDee Lamb, the defense having to account for him opens things up for this nice game for Jake Ferguson, the big game for Jalen Tolbert. You get some interesting plays from Kevontae Turpin. All of those guys have receptions for 25 yards or more. Dak Prescott, willing and able to get the ball down the field. He throws for 352, as you mentioned. You get the multiple touchdowns. You only get a couple of sacks there. At the same time, I don't know that I've ever found myself thinking this, but we were pretty skeptical of the Cowboys running back room. We mentioned earlier in the show Kareem Hunt, not as washed necessarily as people think. I certainly believe that same thing applies to Dalvin Cook, although the fact that the Cowboys haven't been willing to elevate him does point in the other direction. Ezekiel Elliott looks so bad at this point that it's sort of embarrassing for him to be out there, but Rico Dowdle looks good, right? You're watching the first, say, 2/3, 3/4 of this game, and you're thinking they've got to get him more involved, right? Even if you don't have him on your fantasy rosters, even if you're rooting against him, you're just thinking, from the most basic logical perspective of how you do things, why are the Cowboys not using someone who is a pretty decent receiver? He's got air yards on this receiving touchdown. It's not the first time this season that he's made a big play in the receiving game where he's got air yards. And then as a runner, I mean, he's not unbelievable, but when he hits the defenders, he moves them, right? And he runs with some enthusiasm. I mean, this is the type of thing that you're getting from a Jordan Mason. It's the type of thing that you've gotten from a Jalen Warren. Now, not necessarily to that level, but that is the thesis that people had who were enthusiastic about Rico. And I mean, a lot of it is there if the Cowboys will just use him. They do use him quite a bit more down the stretch. He does look good. I expect him to be pretty involved and a very viable fantasy piece going forward. One of the things that I think you have to like about what the Cowboys are doing, even though you have this kind of narrative floating around them of, oh, they underplay their talent, and if they play good teams, they're going to lose. If they play in the playoffs, they're going to lose. Those are things that we have said as well, and I think there's some truth to them. At the same time, you look at this game, and there's a little bit of this Mike Martz versus everyone else element to it, where you're going down the stretch, and when the Steelers take over the ball with 20 seconds left in the game. Now, they do fumble on this final play with all the laterals, but this is a game where the Cowboys had 3 turnovers, the Steelers had 0, and the Cowboys won because outside of the 3 turnovers, because they were willing to take some chances and to play like they want to eventually be an elite team, they were able to win the game. And I mean, that manifests in the numbers where they run 75 plays to 57. There's a limited number of plays if your offense is handing off to Najee Harris, punting, and then just hoping the other team makes mistakes, right? 57 plays is about what you're going to get if that's what you do. The Cowboys dominate in every possible way, and they win, even with the turnovers. I want to think good things about Mike Tomlin. I have always really liked him, and he's clearly doing a good job with this team from a holistic perspective. But you have the combination of having a running back who is probably below replacement level. I mean, there's no question in my mind that Rico Dowdle is a better running back than Najee Harris, and I don't think it's probably even that close. And then on top of that, as you articulated, you have George Pickens, who probably is a solid NFL starter, and then nothing at the wide receiver position. You can't go into a game where Najee Harris is going to end up leading you in receiving. You can't go into a game where Van Jefferson is going to get the second most targets. This is not a legitimate NFL build. And so for both of these teams who have a lot of interesting players on defense, who have viable starting quarterbacks, who have coaches with a lot of success and an extended track record, organizations that are clearly in it to win. I mean, you can certainly make jokes about how that's actually come to fruition or not for the Cowboys, but these are 2 of the best organizations in the NFL, and they've entered the season on the one hand with a team that believes it's viable to run Ezekiel Elliott out there for a handful of plays in the game. And on the other side, you have an organization that thinks that Van Jefferson can be your wide receiver too. You just simply have to have done a better job than this during the offseason, building these teams. And then I think especially from the Steelers side, you've got to play like you want to win a football game. This is, I just believe, a cowardly approach. Justin Fields was not good in this game. He was good the previous week, but you look at it, and in Najee Harris's defense also, I mean, you look at the individual guys and you're like, within the context of who the other players are and who's calling the plays and what we're being asked to do, how are we going to possibly be successful?
So we'll see what they do moving forward this week. But Shawn, we are going to leave it there for this edition of RotoViz Overtime. We are planning our draft for Wednesday for the next Guillotine League. So that will hopefully be our Friday edition of RotoViz OT. Make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get all the episodes once they go live. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at OverToMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. The Zero RB universe will be coming as the week progresses. So check that out, of course. And until we are back, Have a good one.